Okay, good, thanks.
Good evening, friends. Welcome back to In Search of Meaning, a discovery through archaeology in the Bible, through the centuries, to discover its meaning for our lives today in the 21st century. We're so glad that you are back and joining us this evening. How many of you were here for last night's topic? Can I see by show of hands? Wonderful. Did we learn something new? Good. Glad to hear it. Well, this evening we're going to have quite an elevating and an inspiring message, I believe. And so we're glad you're here. The subject tonight will be Jerusalem, City of Peace. Just a reminder that tonight is the last night of the weekend. We will meet again Friday evening. And so enjoy the rest of this week off. Have a good Columbus Day tomorrow. But remember, we will be right back here Friday evening at 6:30. And we hope to see you then. I hope that you remember to drop in your ticket at the registration counter. We have another drawing tonight, so you still have a chance to win that wonderful prize that Pastor Frank has with the lamp. Well, please help me welcome our presenter for the seminar tonight, Dr. Frank Zollman.
I'm glad to see you all tonight after a Sunday of at my house work and hard work. So I'm happy that you chose to spend your Sunday evening with us. Jerusalem, city of peace. I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord. Our feet shall stand within thy gates, O Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a compact city, a city that is built together. Whither the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord, unto the testimony of Israel, to give thanks unto the name of the Lord. For there are set thrones of judgment, the thrones of the house of David. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. They shall prosper that love thee. Peace be within thy walls, and prosperity within thy palaces. For my brethren and companions' sakes, I will now say, peace be within thee. Because of the house of the Lord our God, I will seek thy good. Such is Psalm 122, praying for the peace of Israel. Now, before many of the Psalms, there is something called a superscription. It's kind of like a description or an explanation of the Psalm before you read the Psalm. And this Psalm is called a song of ascents, meaning to go up. And indeed, this Psalm 122 was sung by pilgrims as they made their way up to Jerusalem for the annual pilgrimages. And literally from everywhere surrounding, Jerusalem is up because it's up on a mountain. And so it doesn't matter whether you're coming from north or south or east or west, you go up to Jerusalem because it's higher than all the surrounding area. So let me tell you tonight about Jerusalem, the city of peace. And I plan to cover various topics, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about its history. I'm going to tell you about some of its holy sites. And also, we'll talk about the people. I will not get into the politics of Israel and of the Jewish nation and of the Palestinian territories. There are two things they say you never talk about, politics and religion. And I spend every day talking about religion, so I stay out of politics totally. I think it's the safest way to do it. And then we're going to talk about the promise of the peace to come. The history of Jerusalem is a very long history. We don't know exactly when Jerusalem was founded. It is mentioned in the Ebla tablets, found at a place called Tel Mardik. I've told you a little bit on like the second night about the tablets at Ebla. They date to 2500 BC, and in there it refers to a city named Salem. Salem. Now, the word Salem in Hebrew and Arabic means peace. So it is referred to 2500 BC, so it was already established by then. It is later mentioned in Egyptian hieroglyphic texts that date to the 19th and 18th century BC. The Amorites were ruling Jerusalem at that point in time, and at that point in time it's called Jerusalem. Something like that. Then we have the first biblical mention of Jerusalem in Genesis 14, verse 18. And it says that Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. So this man, Melchizedek, came out and met Abraham. This is the first biblical mention of Jerusalem, here called again Jerusalem, here Salem. And Melchizedek is a figure that we don't know a lot about. He's mentioned in Genesis. He's also mentioned in Hebrews. And it's an interesting name because Melech in Hebrew is king, and Sodech in Hebrew is righteousness. So Melchizedek is literally translated as the king of righteousness, which is an interesting name, and I actually think it has messianic implications. Even could have been Jesus. It's a very fascinating thing. He blesses Abraham. Jerusalem is also mentioned in something called the Amarna letters. The Amarna letters date to the 14th century BC. Again, it's called Jerusalem. And the Amarna letters are very important. They're very fascinating. They are cuneiform letters found in Egypt, written by Canaanite servants to the Egyptian king. And so it's a very interesting thing to find cuneiform tablets in Egypt. And so they're very, very important. And they date to the time of Tutankhamun and also of Akhenaten, which we talked about last night. But Jerusalem really comes into Jewish hands in about the 11th century BC. It comes into the time of David. Now, the Jerusalem is being ruled by some people called the Jebusites, and their city is just on a very small spur of today's Jerusalem. It's called the Ophel Hill. And this is where they're doing excavations now. They've actually found on Ophel Hill the palace, what they believe is the palace of David. They also found some very interesting some ceilings. They're called bulla. And they're the ceilings in clay of ancient documents. So we find biblical names on a number of those documents. This is called the city of David. Joab, who was one of David's generals, found a way into the city. David's men were surrounding the city, but Joab found a way into the city through an ancient water system. And once he was in, he was able to open the gates, and David's army marches in, they defeat the Jebusites, and it becomes the capital of Israel. And the city of Jerusalem remains for 400 years the capital of Israel, of the Jewish nation. It was during this time, after David, that Solomon built the temple there, and we'll talk about that just a little bit more in a little while. In 605 BC, it was conquered by a guy we've also talked about, if you've been at this lecture series, a man named Nebuchadnezzar, who came in 605 and took all kinds of captives. And then in 586, he came to Jerusalem and he burned the temple. The reason he came back in 586 is because the Jewish kings that he had left behind to be puppets were kind of turning their back on him. And so he came back and forcefully took control again. And in this layer in Jerusalem, they find a very heavy burn layer with ashes, and then they find lots and lots of these Babylonian arrows, proving what kind of horrible destruction it was. 70 years later, by decree of the Persians who have conquered the Babylonians, the Jewish people were allowed to come back, and they rebuilt what's called the Second Temple. This city was then continued to be ruled by the Greeks. These are Greek tombs outside Jerusalem. It's interesting that these are Greek tombs, which dates to about 300 BC, but the one on the left is called the Tomb of Absalom, and Absalom was David's son, who dated to about 1000 BC. So it's interesting how traditional places get names that really have nothing to do with what they are. After the Greeks came, the Romans, they sacked Jerusalem in AD 70, and we saw this picture a couple nights ago, and we saw how the Romans record on the Arch of Titus the conquering of Jerusalem and the taking of the golden lampstand. Jerusalem was rebuilt in 135 AD by an emperor named Hadrian. He was tired of the Jewish revolts that were happening, and so he declared that all Jews and Christians had to leave Jerusalem, and he reestablished a Roman city named Aelia Capitolina, which was named after himself. He built, where the Jewish temple was, he built an altar and built a temple to his god Jupiter, and actually sacrificed pigs there, which was a very great sacrilege. Well, in the 4th century AD, Jerusalem is again ruled, and Jews and Christians are allowed to come in because Constantine the Great has become the ruler of the Roman Empire, and he has converted to Christianity. After the Christians, it falls to the Arab Muslims, and then it falls back to the Christians, and then it falls back to the Arab Muslims, and this is the time of the Crusades. So since the time of Jesus, Jerusalem has been wholly or partially destroyed 40 times. 40 times. And because of all this destruction since the time of Jesus, the layers where Jesus walked are actually about 20 feet below the current ground level. Because when the destroyers would come in, they would knock over buildings, and then they would smooth them out and smooth them out with new dirt, and then they would build up. And so many people are disappointed that when they go to Jerusalem, they think they're going to get a walk where Jesus walked. There are only about 3 or 4 places in Jerusalem I can absolutely tell you on this spot Jesus walked. Most of the other places you can say on this spot 20 feet down, Jesus walked. I want to tell you about a few historic places in Jerusalem. One is called Hezekiah's Tunnel. This is a fascinating part of the water system. In 2 Kings 20:20, it says this: "As for the other events of Hezekiah's reign, all his achievements and how he made the pool and the tunnel by which he brought water into the city, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah?" And so we have in Scripture this indication that Hezekiah had a tunnel built. And so it's an interesting confirmation of the scripture that we have actually found the tunnel, and we know where it is. I've actually walked through Hezekiah's tunnel. Have any of you visited Jerusalem? I should have asked you that. Did you walk through Hezekiah's tunnel? Yeah, it's a very interesting experience. If you don't mind getting wet, you'll get wet about to there, somewhere in that area. So the Hezekiah's tunnel begins at something called the Gijón Spring, and the Gijón Spring was outside the city walls, and it was low on the hill. Now the problem was that when Jerusalem was attacked, because it was so low on the hill, the walls didn't go around it. The conquerors, if they found out where the well was, it was a spring actually. It was a never-ending spring, and so it was vulnerable to conquerors. And so what they did was they first built a wall around it to try to protect it, but that didn't work because it was so far down on the hill. From the next hill over, archers could kill people coming to the Gijón Spring. And so what they did was they, in essence, covered over the Gijón Spring, and they dug a tunnel through the hill and brought the water inside the city. Now, you understand this property of water, that it seeks its own level. So that means that they had to dig inside the city deep enough so the water would flow in. They couldn't move the city walls, so they had to move the spring. And this they did by digging this tunnel. This tunnel is 1,750 feet long. It's a third of a mile. It's interesting that they started from one end and from the other end and dug straight toward each other. Well, not quite. You can see that picture. It's kind of like kind of a circuitous route. And to me, it's a miracle they found each other. There is some evidence that they might have been following some cracks in the rock, which kind of led them to the right area. And so they dug together until they came to this spot, and this is the pool of Salome. And Jesus, there's a story in John 9 of Jesus in the pool of Salome, where he healed a man's eyes, and he told him to go wash in the pool of Salome. Here is the area where, the spot where they met, and it's just a little offset. They were kind of missing each other, and we know about this moment, this dramatic moment, because they inscribed it up in the Gijón Spring. They inscribed an inscription that talks about the breaking through. It says this, and this is the story of the breaking through. While the stonecutters were swinging their axes, each toward his fellow, and while there were yet 3 cubits, that would be 3 times 18, so about 4.5 feet. While there were still 3 cubits to be pierced through, there was heard the voice of a man calling to his fellow, for there was a crevice on the right. And on the day of the piercing through, the stonecutters struck through each to meet his fellow, axe against axe. Then ran the water from the spring to the pool for 1,200 cubits, and 100 cubits was the height of the rock above the head of the stone covers. So think about the fact that they are 100 cubits underground, and a cubit is 18 inches, 1.5 feet, so they're about 150 feet when they pierce together, about 150 feet underground. This is just an incredible engineering feat, and if you ask me how it was possible, I would tell you that it was a gift of God. I believe God protected his people, and you can tell me all about the engineering you want in the crevices, but I believe that God helped them get this done. The Salome inscription is no longer in Jerusalem. It was found in the late 1800s when the Ottoman Empire was still in control of Palestine. And so, unfortunately, the inscription was chipped off the wall. You can see it was damaged very badly. And this inscription is today in the Istanbul Museum in Turkey. It's one of those artifacts that I think is meaningless to the people in Turkey, and one of those artifacts that I think should be repatriated and sent back to the Jerusalem Museum. It probably never will be. The walls of the old city of Jerusalem are fascinating to walk around. It was my goal last time I was in Jerusalem to walk all the way around the walls of the old city. I didn't quite make it. I was almost there. I'd almost finished it, and I was on the east side of Jerusalem, the old walls, and I stumbled into a Muslim cemetery, and I was very unceremoniously told that I should be gone out of there, and to emphasize it, there were a few rocks hurled my way, and so I decided that I thought that was probably a good idea too. This is some of the decorations on the gates. They're so fascinating to see. Here's a slot in the wall this is built in medieval times, and this is a slot in the wall that was built to shoot arrows through. Even though it's a narrow slot on this side, on the other side it's open so that you could get in and shoot arrows at various angles through the walls. This is called Damascus Gate. The reason being is because this opens onto a road that ultimately would lead to Damascus. The walls of the city have been built over and over again through the years. The current ones were built by this guy whose name was Suleiman, a derivation of Solomon, a Muslim leader who was an Arab caliph, and they were finished in 1542. Now, I love this guy's name. He is known as Solomon the Magnificent. He did not suffer from problems of self-esteem. There are three religions that Jerusalem is holy to. First, the Christians, because, of course, it is where Jesus walked. He died here. He was buried here. He rose from the dead here. He ascended to heaven from here. But it's also sacred to the Jews because this is the cradle of their national heritage. This is the promised land. This is the land that God gave them. The holy temple was there in the promised land. And then the third group who hold this land holy is the Muslims. It's the third most sacred place in Islam, second only to Medina and don't have that in my notes. Mecca, thank you very much. Mecca and Medina. It's from the top of the Temple Mount, where the Dome of the Rock is, that Muhammad ascended into heaven. So it is, as I said, the third most holy shrine in Islam. Now, as I said earlier, most people are disappointed that they can't walk where Jesus walked. But here is one of those spots that I absolutely tell you Jesus walked. These are the steps that led up to the old temple from the time of Jesus. And even though some of them, you can tell the ones that look really, really good, those have been reconstructed. But the ones that don't look so good are ancient to the time of Jesus. And I can tell you that on these steps, Jesus walked. Also, this is at the bottom of the temple wall, and this is an excavation where they have dug out this temple, and this street level is this tunnel, and this street level is the level at which Jesus would have walked. And so this is another one of those places. And then recently, within the last 10 years, they found these steps that lead up to the House of Caiaphas. And of course, Jesus went for his trial to the House of Caiaphas. And so these steps are also steps where Jesus, actually his feet would have walked. Many of the holy places for Christians have to do with the last events of Jesus' life. This is the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is such a pleasant walk. I remember the first time I was in Israel, I was there for about 30 days. And I remember one Sabbath, we went to the Jewish synagogue, which was very fascinating. But the next Sabbath, I just wanted to be out on my own. And so I got my Bible and I walked up down through the Kidron Valley, out of Jerusalem, and up to the Mount of Olives. And I just sat for hours underneath an olive tree there on the Mount of Olives. It was very, very pleasant. At the foot of the Mount of Olives is the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus had his great agony. It's believed that the meaning of Garden of Gethsemane means pressing, the place of pressing. And so it's believed that there was an olive press here because there were lots of olive trees. But it's very appropriate, isn't it, that Jesus had his place of pressing in the place of pressing. Close by to the Garden of Gethsemane is this rock built inside the Church of All Nations. And it is that rock that is the traditional spot where they say Jesus fell and had his agony. The Church of All Nations is a fascinating, not an ancient church, but an old church. Many Christians want to walk along the Via Dolorosa. And there's a famous song, if you haven't heard it, about the Via Dolorosa. It's the way of sorrow. And Jesus walked along this road, or at least parts of this road, probably. It's a place today that many times Christians will do kind of like a reenactment of the walk of Jesus on his way to Calvary, carrying crosses. And this is one of the stations. And each station tells what happened to Jesus there. And at this station, Jesus fell while he was carrying the cross. There are 12 stations, and it's quite interesting to walk and contemplate what Jesus did and contemplate Jesus' sacrifice. But wherever there are pilgrims, there are also, what's a nice way to put this? Souvenir salesmen. And so you're wanting to walk along the street and contemplate the death of Jesus and what he did for us. And postcard. Authentic Bethlehem olive carving, you know. And it's there was one of my famous ones. One of my favorite ones was the Fifth Stop T-shirt shop. I'm not thinking about T-shirts when I'm walking the Via Dolorosa. There is also at one of the stops, it's very hard to see, but there are etchings in these stones. And this commemorates where the soldiers gambled over Jesus' clothes when he was before Pilate. Then this is called the Ecce Homo Arch, which means, behold the man. And it ends at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's said that this is the place of the cross, the crucifixion, and the burial of Jesus. Now, this is one of the traditional spots for the crucifixion and for Calvary and for the tomb of Jesus. And I should say it like this. This spot is commemorated mostly by Christians who are of a more Orthodox persuasion, Eastern Orthodox, Ethiopian Orthodox, Roman Catholics. Because in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there are lots of incense censers and lots of ceremonies. And most Protestants don't connect with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I didn't, even though I believe it's probably likely the actual burial place of Jesus. But the other place is called the Garden Tomb. And Christians have a tendency to connect more with the Garden Tomb than they do the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's said that Jesus was crucified at Golgotha, the place of the skull. And so here is the side of a hill that was identified as the place of the skull. And if you look very carefully, you can kind of see in the side of this hill some indentations that look like the void of the eyes of a skull, and then underneath the nose where a nose would be. And so this place was in 1883 identified by a guy named Charles Gordon, that this is where Jesus was crucified, where Golgotha or Calvary was. And nearby in this area they found a tomb, and it's called the Garden Tomb. It is a lovely place to go and think about the death of Jesus and his resurrection. Last time I was there, we had communion overlooking the Garden Tomb. It was a lovely thing to do. This is looking in at the burial spot. There are two burial spots in this tomb. One has been used and one has not. And then looking out, it's such a lovely picturesque setting. In 1894, when they found this tomb, they excavated it, and there were some Protestant missionaries who were living in Jerusalem, and they wanted to explore this area. And so they found this tomb, and the excavation probably revealed that this is not from the time of Jesus. This tomb probably dates to 800 to 600 BC, and perhaps it was adapted later for use during the Roman period. But as I say, most Christians like this spot. However, it's the other spot, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that has a longer history. It was built by a woman that we know of as Helena, the mother of Constantine the Great. We talked about her on another night, you might remember. And when Constantine the Great became a Christian, she was already a Christian, and she went around finding places, the holy places. And this was the spot she found, and so there's literally been a church on this site since the 4th century AD. And it was first built by Helena. Inside the church is this shrine, and it is built over what is considered to be the grave of Jesus. They've been doing, you could pick up some YouTube videos on this. They did a massive reconstruction or restoration of this tomb and of the overbuilding and the shrine. And they also actually did inside a restoration of the grave that they believe Jesus was buried in. It's a very fascinating documentary done on this, and I would encourage you to go watch it on YouTube. And many people believe that this is the burial place of Jesus, and that behind this glass, you can barely see it, is the rock of Mount Calvary. There it is, where Jesus was crucified. It's interesting that there is in a place called Madaba in Jordan, there's a 6th century AD church, and in that church there is this interesting mosaic that is a picture of Jerusalem in the 6th century AD, and there on the mosaic map is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So it's a very, very ancient church. I've actually got to see this mosaic in person. It's very fascinating to see. Other places that Christians like to go to are the upper room. The upper room is simply not truly the upper room, because this was built during the Crusader period. So this is built 1,000 years too late to be actually the upper room where Jesus met with his disciples. Let me tell you about some Jewish holy places. Probably the most important Jewish holy place is this wall. It's called the Western Wall, or more properly known by tourists as the Wailing Wall. It's a very fascinating place to visit. I'm standing here at the foot of the wall and taking a picture up. And I remember when I took this picture, there was a Jewish man standing at the wall praying next to me to my right. And I was shooting a 35 millimeter SLR film camera at that point in time when I took this picture before I got a digital camera. And because of the lens action, I just kind of flipped my camera up and went click. And the guy next to me gives me a dirty, dirty, dirty look. And I kind of felt badly that I had invaded his prayer space. These walls were the retaining walls of a large construction project that Herod the Great built. He wanted to increase the amount of space up on the Temple Mount, and so he built these retaining walls and filled in the dirt, so he doubled the space up on top of the Temple Mount. Inside these walls are these very interesting vaulted chambers. These are called Solomon's stables, but again, these were built 1,000 years too late for Solomon. So it's interesting how things get these names. I found it interesting to talk to some of the soldiers last time I was there. There are always lots of soldiers at the Western Wall, either praying or on duty. And so I had to have my picture taken with the soldiers at the Wailing Wall. This wall is the closest the Jews can get to the site of the old Temple Mount, since the top is claimed now by the Muslims. And so this is why this wall is so sacred. It is a divided wall because there are a space for the men on the left and the women on the right. I found it interesting that the space on the left for the men is twice as big as the space on the right for the women. I just think that says something about what women are expected, what's expected of them. It is a place of prayer. You can see the observant Jewish men going up to the wall and praying, kissing the wall. And this is an interesting practice. There are pads of paper and pencils before you enter the wall. And the idea is to write prayers and fold them up and then stuff them into the cracks of the walls. So when you go up to the wall itself, all of these cracks are stuffed full of prayers, which I really kind of like that idea. I think it's a very touching idea. The history of the Temple Mount is quite fascinating. It is believed that this is the place where Abraham came to sacrifice Isaac. So the history of this Temple Mount goes all the way back to Abraham. Solomon built a temple here. It was destroyed by the Babylonians. Zerubbabel built a second temple here. It was enlarged by Herod the Great, and then it was destroyed in AD 70, as we said earlier. It's interesting to see around the Temple Mount these huge piles of stone that are left over from the destruction by the Romans. And I'll remind you of this text in which Jesus says, it says, Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came to him to call his attention to its buildings. Do you see these things? He asked. Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left upon another. Every one will be thrown down. It's an interesting thing to see the fulfillment of that prophecy. As I said earlier, Hadrian built a temple to Jupiter in 135 on this place. It was destroyed by the Christians, by Constantine the Great. And then in the 6th century AD, the Muslims came and built the Dome of the Rock. And at that point in time, there was nothing there. And so they just built this shrine called the Dome of the Rock. I tell you, there must be incredible treasures buried in that Temple Mount. And they'll probably never be found. But there were some interesting things that have been found that gives you an idea of how spectacular this once was. On the western wall, just down a little ways from the Wailing Wall, there's this construction that comes off the side of the wall, and it looks very unimpressive, but this is the reconstruction. It was the end of an arch that was a monumental staircase that allowed people to come from the valley up to the Temple Mount itself. This is called Robinson's Arch, and it was named after a guy named Robinson who first suggested that this is what its use was. The rocks on the Temple Mount are very, very interesting because the walls were built with these stones that are called Herodian stones, and they're square, but they have this interesting margin around the outside. So if you're in Jerusalem and you see these kind of stones built into walls, you automatically know that this was actually built during the time of Jesus. They also discovered in excavations this stone, which says, "To the place of trumpeting." And it's believed that this was once upon a time on the balustrade up on the Temple Mount where the priest would come at the beginning of Sabbath in order to blow the shofar, the trumpets, for the beginning of Sabbath. Well, let me tell you about the Muslim holy places. The main one is the Dome of the Rock. It is not a mosque, it is a shrine, a holy place. There is another mosque up on top, but this is the Dome of the Rock. I have had the privilege of actually going into the Dome of the Rock. You cannot go in today. If you are not a Muslim, you cannot go in. But first time was there 29 and a half years ago, and they were still allowing infidels to go into the Dome of the Rock. And it's a beautiful, fascinating place. They also have this mosque. It's called El Aqsa Mosque, which means the furthest mosque. And this is where the faithful would worship. Inside the Dome of the Rock are the way it's constructed. The walls are built out of marble, and it's just a very lovely building. As I say, it was built in about 600 AD. Inside, there is this large stone, and it's this stone that the Muslims believe that Muhammad was standing on when he ascended to heaven. And there is a spot where you can reach up and touch the stone, and actually you can see or you can feel the footprints of Muhammad, which were left in the stone. At least that's what they say. When you go to Jerusalem today, it is the thing that stands out the most of all. And this is the inside of the dome. One of the windows. The Muslims, as are the Jews, are very careful about not portraying humans or animals in their art. And so you won't see any of that in their art. It's a very fascinating place to be. The dome was originally covered with gold sheeting, but it didn't survive the Middle Ages. It was reconstructed as lead until 1958, and now what you see here, this gold, is a composite of a bronze aluminum alloy. The streets of Jerusalem are always crowded, and you see all kinds of people there. Psalm 122 says, "Pray for the peace of Jerusalem." The one thing that struck me in Jerusalem was we are not used to a heavy military presence like they are in Israel. And the psalm is almost prophetic. Pray for the peace of Israel, of Jerusalem. Because not only do you have the three religions vying with each other, but you also have three ethnic groups. You have the Jewish people who are descended from Isaac. You have the Arabs who are descended from Abraham through Ishmael, they say. And perhaps this is part of the problem, but I think it's too simplistic to describe the exact problem. Jerusalem was under Ottoman Turkish rule until 1917, and then the British came in and took control of all of Palestine, also had control of Egypt at that point in time. And it was ruled by Britain until 1947, when the United Nations decided to divide the countries up and make a Jewish homeland. And so in 1948, the Jewish homeland was declared, and immediately, what happened? War broke out. The Arabs tried to, at the very beginning, before they could get a foothold, tried to kill and destroy the Jewish nation, but they were not successful. In 1967, there was something called the 6-Day War, and at that point in time, you can see the evidence of the 6-Day War. At that point in time, Israel pushed its enemies away and occupied the Sinai Peninsula, occupied what's called the Golan Heights, which they took from Syria, and they also took the West Bank, which Jordan had controlled and the Palestinians lived in. They took that also in 1967. The Arabs in the rest of the country are Israeli citizens with all the privileges, but the Arabs in the occupied territories are not Israeli citizens. In 1980, Jerusalem was declared to be the capital of Israel for all time, and that includes the West Bank. The tensions are high. Just this year, the United States moved our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, in essence saying we recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So what's happening? There's attack and counterattack and poke and counterpoke, and you hit me, I'll hit you harder. You hit me harder, I'll hit you even harder. And that's kind of what's going on in Israel today. Most Americans, as I say, are uncomfortable with the military presence that is very high profile in Jerusalem. I remember the first time I was there, I hadn't been in Jerusalem over a day yet. The guy that I was meeting, that was leading the tour I was on, he took me out for pizza that night, which was very interesting to eat pizza in Israel. Not traditional American pizza. So we get into this little hole-in-the-wall pizza joint, and both of us sit on stools up against the counter, up at a counter with a wall about this far behind us, and 3 soldiers came in, and they are fully armed with machine guns. And as they tried to get to the seats on the other side of us, I felt one of them, he didn't do it on purpose, understand, but he just has it hanging in front of him. I felt the muzzle of his machine gun rake across my back. It was kind of like, woo. What a feeling, you know? Most Americans find that a little bit distressing. I believe that currently the two-state solution seems to be a strong position to get peace, but I don't know where they'll draw the lines. Will they ever get together? I don't know. Can peace ever come to Jerusalem? I'm not hopeful here and now, but I hope sometime it might. Many Christians are pro-Jewish due to the belief that the Jews are still God's chosen people and have never ceased to be so. That is a misunderstanding of biblical theology. Here's this text in Galatians 3:29. It says, if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. That means that if you are a Christian, if you love Jesus, that all of those promises God gave to Abraham and to Isaac and Jacob and to the Jewish nation all those years ago, all those promises are going to be fulfilled in the Christian church, in those who follow Jesus. And so this idea that we have to be friends of Israel because they are God's chosen people is a misguided understanding of Scripture. And there are a lot of people out there with that theology. But I believe it's misguided. In the book of Revelation, John foretells a time when there will be peace in Jerusalem. Revelation 21 verse 4 says this, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, nor mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. John foretells a time in this world, in Jerusalem, where there will be no more death, nor mourning, nor crying, or pain. They'll all be passed away. There will be peace, but only at a specific time. Because I'm going to work my way back in this verse to verses 2 and 3, because this tells us when that will happen. John says, I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully adorned or dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. You see, when that happens, when that prophecy is fulfilled, when there is peace in Jerusalem, it won't be under man's authority. It'll be because God starts over again. And the holy city, did you pick up the word? The new Jerusalem. There will be peace then. And God will be with his people. We take one step back further to see when that happens in Revelation 21:1. The first verse of that chapter says, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no more sea. You see, in order for this to happen, God has to start over again. The old things will pass away, and God will create all things new, a new heaven and a new earth. Now, we shouldn't be surprised at this. In 2 Peter 3:10, we read this, but the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar. The elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything in it will be laid bare. This is a prophecy that one of these days, this world is going to be destroyed at what we call the second coming. We studied that one night. And the earth and everything, the elements will be destroyed, and the earth will be laid bare. It continues on. In 2 Peter 3, he says, as you look forward to the day of God and speed its coming, that day will bring about the destruction of the heavens by fire, and the elements will melt in the heat. But in keeping with his promise, we are looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth, the home of righteousness. Jesus promised us that he was going to prepare a place like this for us. He promised us. He says this in John 14, 1 through 3. Perhaps one of the most wonderful texts of the whole New Testament. He says, do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. I am going there to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you may also be where I am. See, Jesus promised when he was here that he was going to go prepare a place for us. This new Jerusalem, this place where sin and suffering has been totally done away with. And it will be a perfect world. This is the perfect world that Abraham was looking forward to. All those 2,800 years ago, Abraham was looking forward to this. In Hebrews 11, the faith chapter, it says, by faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. Now, it's talking about Abraham leaving Ur of the Chaldees and coming to live in Canaan or in the promised land. But that was not his home. That was not his home, because it continues on. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. Verse 10, for he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. You see, this is not just a new promise God has given. God has been promising this new heavens and new earth, this new Jerusalem, for 3,800 years. It was what Abraham hoped for. It's what all the people who loved God have hoped for. A new place to live. A new perfect world. Isaiah talks about this. We saw this verse a couple nights ago. As the new heavens and a new earth that I will make will endure before me, declares the Lord, so will your name and your descendants endure. Here's a wonderful promise that you can be there. It wouldn't be good news if God was making such a wonderful place and he said, oh, by the way, you have to pay $1 million to get a house. I wouldn't be there. I don't think any of you would be there either. But this is a place he's prepared, and he promises your name and your descendants will endure there. For from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, all mankind will come and bow down before me. Jesus promises that in this new earth, we will come and be with him weekly on the Sabbath. He'll come and he'll join us in worship because he wants us to be there. How can we have a part in this? How can that happen? How then shall we live? Peter asks the same question. He says, since everything will be destroyed in this way, what kind of people ought you to be? You ought to live holy and godly lives as you look forward to the day of God and speed its coming. Holy and godly people, hoping every single day that Jesus is coming again. Jesus called to Jerusalem, and he calls to us. Listen to this plaintive cry of Jesus. Matthew 23:37. He says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who sent you. How often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you are not willing. You know, Jesus wanted more than anything for Jerusalem, for the people in Jerusalem to follow him. He says, oh, Jerusalem. Hear the plea in his voice. Oh, Jerusalem. I want to gather you. As a mother hen gathers her chicks, I want to gather you. I want you to follow me. I want you to be part of my kingdom. And he does the same thing for us today. He wants you. He calls to you. He pleads to you. Oh, Frank, put your name in there. Read it with me. Oh, put your name in. How often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. Jesus is calling for you to be his person. He wants to gather his people home because he wants to take us to that earth that he's prepared for us. And I am eager to be there. Let me just pray for you as we close. Dear Father, I just thank you so much that you have prepared a place for me. For me. Wow. And I ask you, Father, to just continue to draw me and to draw these people here and to gather us together because you want us to be in that home that you prepared for us. Perfect home. No more sin, no sorrow, no suffering, no pain, no death. That we see every day here. We hear it on the news. It'll all be done. It'll all be gone. How wonderful that'll be. And by giving our lives to you tonight, again, we can assure ourselves a place there. A reservation has been made in my name. Thank you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. I have one last thing. I'm running a few minutes long tonight, but I have one last thing that I want to share with you. That's not the right one. We're slowly getting off YouTube because I can't play this on YouTube.